I've made a few changes to my build since my last video. This video is to explain those changes, explain the things that I've learned, that I've adjusted the way I'm approaching this, and hopefully those explanations will help you make your own build. So first, in the previous video, I chose Carnage as the second board and put with the exploit glyph, and third was Blood Rage with Revenge. I'm doing that opposite this time. So the first board I'm choosing after the starter board here is Blood Rage with the Revenge glyph. The reason for that change is that it's a little deceptive. You want your rare node bonuses, the ones you care about the most, to be in your first board, like I explained in the previous video. And if you look on the second board here, the Carnage board, I'm actually taking 4 rare nodes, which is more than this board. But if you factor into your calculations the Revenge glyph, which is giving you an extra bonus to all of your rare nodes in the glyph area, this ends up being the board that has the more significant benefit if you take it early. So I'll show you the numbers here. The Carnage board with exploit gives 25%. This is just the bonuses you're getting from the rare nodes on the board. 25% for 25% damage for all of the rare nodes used here, which is 4. This one, this, and this. You can't quite see it off the screen, but whatever. It's 25%. 25% damage and 4.5% damage reduction on the Carnage and Exploit board. The Blood Rage and Revenge, because Revenge buffs rare nodes, ends up with 39% damage and 11.5% damage reduction, even though it's only using 3 rare nodes. So this is giving me 10% damage. This is giving me 11.5% damage reduction. And this is another 29% damage. So you're choosing, I think that this is the move. If you're not using the Revenge glyph because you don't prioritize damage reduction, then this doesn't matter to you. You would have a different glyph here and your order could change. You could just prioritize based on like the number of, this board would have been better than this board if I wasn't taking Revenge. But if you're taking Revenge to buff your rare nodes, you want it to be in your first board. That means that really kind of changes how you start out. And also another thing to think about is that because this only buffs rare nodes and isn't a bonus contingent on the amount of a specific node type taken in the glyph area, you are able to get into this glyph area, pick the glyph, and get out and go to the next board quicker. You're spending less points here in the glyph area than you are here because this gives you a bonus based on dex. So you're taking more points in the glyph area generally. It's very small. It's probably only a few points. It's not a big deal, but it is different. See, I'm only taking 29 willpower here. I'm taking 44 dex. That's a meaningful difference in terms of how many points I'm taking. So that'll help you progress farther in the Paragon, along the Paragon boards as well, making this choice. So that's why I switched that. Everything else in the board or on the build is pretty much the same as last video. Things have just moved around a little bit, but it's the same nodes, it's the same boards, it's just where you connect them or whatever. The next thing I want to talk about is that I've altered my conception of my build slightly. So one thing is I made a really stupid assumption, which looking back it seems foolish now. For some reason I was expecting this to mean that whenever this unconstrained node to mean that whenever you triggered berserking, it actually just triggered berserking that was 5 seconds longer. That might not be the case. Maybe you have to get this and spec into berserk duration in order to make this maximum duration part matter. If that's the case, then this node isn't nearly as good, and I'm much more inclined to use Walking Arsenal. So even though you would be using more of your arsenal, have to use more weapons, you would get added benefits on top of it, and in like being able to spec into the swap, giving you Fury and some other things. So if this doesn't actually directly increase the duration of berserking and it only just gives it a damage bonus, it's not bad. It's still fine. If you have berserk all the time, it's basically just. I think that plus 25% is making berserk's damage bonus 50%. I don't think that 25% is giving you 25% of 25%, but that math is not something we know. And you'll see a lot of videos of people making assumptions. We don't know. You can make your guess about what's what. If for some reason that is the case, then it might be visible in the tooltip. You might just be able to not have this node, generate berserking, look at your tooltip, and then select this node, generate berserking, and look at your tooltip and see what the damage number changes on the minimum value of some skill, and that might tell you whether or not what exactly this plus 25% is doing. Regardless, even if like if it's as good as it could be, if it actually does make the damage bonus of berserk 50% and not 25, which is what I assume, then you still might want this. You still might rather have Walking Arsenal if you can get to the third. If you can use all three weapon types to get the full bonus. Okay, so my build is going to transition heavily. It's going to be Rend initially. When I get down here to the bottom, I'm going to rely heavily on Deathblow and still have Rend. I'm going to drop most of my shouts and have Wrath of the Berserker. And then it transitions after that. There's a point where with enough gear, with enough mods in the right gear slots, you can get permanent shouts, and that's going to radically change what's worthwhile on the tree. And so I have a whole nother build where I adjust out of certain things and into other things. And I'll go over that a little bit later. But that's basically the thought process behind a lot of these things that I'm saying, and a lot of the things that I've learned over the last like 4 or 5 days. And so take that into account when I'm giving my advice, because maybe it doesn't apply to your build, and if it doesn't, then you need to know where and then adjust accordingly. So one thing to note is that, and also according to that, or given that, I may be transitioning into Whirlwind to basically as soon as I can get permanent shouts. If that is the case, then my build changes radically. Now I care about crit, because Rend was a big part of my damage earlier, and I didn't want to take the node to make Rend crit because I was using Deathblow. It seemed like partially a waste. But if you transition to something like Whirlwind or Hoda, something that crit benefits, then you all of a sudden crit matters. All of a sudden bleeding matters less. Bleeding damage anyway, but matters less. It should change your build in a meaningful way, and for some reason it just really didn't. So I want to talk about why, because I think that's kind of a strange aspect. You would think that going from a non-crit build that is at least 50% bleeding damage and going into a build that's crit and you hit more often and your bleeds aren't nearly as significant, you would think that would result in a meaningful change on the Paragon tree, and it isn't. Maybe I'm doing it wrong. Maybe there's something I'm not seeing that you can see. You can tell me in the comments. But I don't think that it actually changes my build, which I think is a huge negative actually for Diablo 4. I don't think you should be able to build a generally viable, like solid, strong Paragon board and have it be kind of better than the other options, even if you have something very specific. I think that's not good, but that is nevertheless where we are. So part of that is because if you go here and you type critical and you look for things on the Paragon board that are Paragon boards that are going to affect crits, then you have very few options. So this is increasing your attack speed. The bonus is extremely minor. I could spend the whatever points to get there, but I don't think 8% attack speed is worth those 5 points to me. If I change my mind, I can always get that. It doesn't seem like it. And if you notice, there really isn't much lit up here. It's the green you see here. Those are the ones that have the word critical in them. And if you look at the other boards that I have, it's nothing. It's just this one legendary node is the only thing on all of my other Paragon boards that even references critical strikes. And of the 3 boards I didn't choose, 2 of them don't have anything. And then this one board, this is the only board that seems to benefit critical strikes. And when you look here, it seems to be definitely worthwhile. That's 15. This is another 30 if you get the bonus. Let's say 15 if you don't. So it's 30 to 45% crit damage. That seems significant, actually, plus that. So it's a lot. The problem is when you get over here, this says crit damage, which looks initially really good, but if you look at the end there, it says one-handed. This is one-handed, this is one-handed, this is one-handed. These are good damage reduction nodes, so maybe it's worth it still. But you have to be heavy crit at this point. At this point, this is only benefiting you if you crit. There's a little physical damage there and there. So it's not terrible. This is only benefiting one-handed attacks. That is a really terrible thing. If you're speccing into crit, you're probably doing Whirlwind because of the aspect that increases the critical strikes the longer you channel it, or critical chance the longer you channel it. And if you are doing that, are you really using one-handed weapons? I don't know. That is such a heavy restriction that I just don't think it's worth it. I think maybe the general damage you get out of the other boards is fine. Maybe the little bonus you would get to crit is just not worth it to go into this board. This is increasing your crit chance, but it's a very small amount and it scales up over time. And again, it's one-handed restriction. So you really have to love your one-handers to go this way. Maybe that's not so bad. If you think about it, you could stack really good aspects on your two-handed weapons and you get double the bonus, and then use your one-handers and switch them out and make them as good as possible. So maybe that's the way to go. If you use this board, you'd probably just want to come in the left gate here next to the most generic crit damage you can get. You'd want to spec in this way, up like this, filling out those nodes, and coming down here into the glyph area. And then when you exited, you want to probably want to exit this direction, out south. And this is a willpower board. So if you were going to use this board, you would probably still not want the legendary node, even if you were speccing crit. You'd probably just want to pick up that chunk, the glyph area, and then get out the south direction because it's more efficient than the other side. And you would want to replace this board here, Weapon Master. So on this board, all you're doing is getting in, getting the glyph, and getting out anyway. This is giving you physical damage, which is generic. It's not quite as restrictive as the other board, but if you're going crit, you're getting a good amount out of the other board. I think it's probably worth it. This other node here is just armor. This chunk here is just armor. So that's not a big sacrifice. And the glyph is still willpower, so it'd pretty much be the same. You just plug this willpower glyph into the Flawless Technique board and put it here instead of Weapons Master. And you are really you're not getting to this board until kind of late, so maybe you've already made that decision by then, and this isn't a respec. Maybe this is just something you plug in. All right, so that's it. There's really very little else on that. There's nothing else on the Paragon boards that are references crit. Doesn't really change anything about how you play. The snapshotting of effects isn't really reflected heavily in any of these Paragon stats. So that's kind of the only change I would make to my board if I was heavily speccing into the Whirlwind. which might end up being the way to go. There are some adjustments I may be making to my build, transitioning to perma-shouts and crit, and they're mostly reflected in glyph choices. So if you're using Whirlwind, then I'm probably dropping Exploit. I'm dropping that because the node on your skill tree that makes your next core skill Inflict Vulnerable really changes when you're using Whirlwind because it's a channeling skill. So you would use some sort of Weapon Master skill which would enable that effect. You would click your Whirlwind, and the entire duration of the Whirlwind, you should be making everything vulnerable. Just like every hit is making them vulnerable again and again and again. And so speccing a couple points into that node instead of using this for vulnerable is probably worthwhile. And that's radically changing probably how I'm playing. I'm using Whirlwind to do damage way more than I would be using Rend. With Rend and Deathblow, I'm probably clearing primarily with Deathblow and obviously lunging. But with Whirlwind, it changes the dynamic of what you're doing, and also like the shouts, and just generally how it would play would be different. You would pop your shouts, you would lunge, or you would lunge and pop your shouts, and then you would Deathblow, and then you would Whirlwind, and you would kill everything for 4 seconds, whatever. And then you would do it again. You would pop the shouts, you would lunge, you would Deathblow, and then you would Whirlwind again for the duration. And you would just do that. That would be the playstyle. I think that probably will play extremely smoothly, and that'll probably be the way that I transition and end up building my character late game. If I do that, then I don't think I care about this as much. I have more reliable, more predictable way to make enemies vulnerable than this. And I don't agree with the damage bucket videos that you're seeing online. I think that they're wrong. So I don't think the damage to vulnerable targets here is significantly meaningful. I think that damage bonus is the same as damage to close or whatever. I don't actually think that they're in separate buckets. So I would drop this glyph. This is the likely choice if you're heavily speccing into Whirlwind, then you'd want to increase crit damage. The bonus here would be substantial. This is a multiplicative effect with the other damage types that you're primarily getting on gear and in the other glyphs. So and the extra furry regeneration is just a bonus. This would certainly be a must if you're going crit Whirlwind. This also is super interesting if you are switching weapons and taking advantage of the Walking Arsenal key passive. I think that this might be worthwhile. So something to think about with this is that does the bonus here snapshot with Whirlwind? It says swap weapons has 18% chance to cause crit. I've sort of abbreviated the way this reads on my sheet here. But basically, will it make it so that every hit of Whirlwind has this chance, or just the first one? It's supposed to snapshot, so probably all of them, and if all of them, then that's kind of insane. And then the damage here to skills that swap weapons as well, does that snapshot with Whirlwind? If it does, then this glyph is immense. So what you would end up doing is sticking Mortal Draw or Wrath into the board where we put Exploit, which is Carnage. So you'd stick one of them into Carnage, and you would stick the other one actually into your starter board, which isn't a great option because there's only 39 decks in your starting board, which is obviously not giving you the bonus you want. So you would have to pick which glyph do you want to get the worst bonus out of. I mean, and it could be this. Although, to be honest, I don't know. That's a tough choice. One of these three, either Mortal Draw or Territorial or Wrath, one of those three would end up going in your starting board. And there really isn't a way around that I see. I don't see another good Dex board option. And the bonuses you get on those boards are too substantial. And another thing to sort of like think about is that you're only losing one node. So it might seem like 39 is much less, but one of these boards only has 44. I forget which one. So you're only losing one node worth of bonus here. So you're losing 16% damage to skill swap weapons, or you're losing 9.6 damage to close targets, or increased crit damage to your core skills. And you're only losing one node. There is a cited benefit to that, which is that you're speccing less into strength on your starting board. The respec should be simple. You're not changing out a whole board, you're just changing some nodes. That should make it fairly easy to do. And I think that numerically that's going to end up being better if you end up transitioning to Whirlwind with crit, which I probably will after thinking about it for a week. Okay. Something else I wanted to talk about with the Paragon build is that I'm probably skipping stuff to get to hemorrhage as soon as possible. This is while leveling, obviously. So you're still in a transition point of gear here. Your glyphs are not all maxed. You have fewer of them. A lot of them, the ones that you wanted, have not dropped. You're in that kind of situation. And in that kind of situation, the rare nodes are better than the glyph nodes because you just don't have great glyphs to stick in them yet. In that situation, leveling up, you want to get to the nodes that have the greatest impact on your DPS as possible, and I think hemorrhage is that. So if you're killing something in faster than 3 seconds, then I just don't think it matters. If you're killing something in 3 seconds and speccing more into killing it in 3 seconds is not helping you. If, however, things are lasting longer than 3 seconds, which I expect the bosses to do, this node is going to give you the biggest bang for the buck. You want to get to it as quick as possible, but you also don't want to have to respec again and again and again. So you're still picking the same board order, but what you would do is so pick your first glyph area, spec into that as you need, as you get a glyph that's worthwhile to put in there. That would change what nodes are in there, but that's a fairly minor respec. The first board, which is Blood Rage, you go up, you get the rare nodes and the glyph node, and you get out. That's all you'd want to get, even if you had Revenge. If for some reason you don't have Revenge, you can stick something else here, and you can barely get the threshold requirement to make it worthwhile. You can change that as you go. It's fine. Spec into the next board, get to the glyph area, move out, and then go up to this Berserker damage cluster, damage to elites. These damage clusters. The rare nodes are giving you your best bang for your buck before your glyphs are really like worthwhile, and you're putting 1 point in to add the Weapons Master board here. Just 1 point to set the board order. Now, I talked earlier about the transition to Crit Whirlwind. If you're doing that and you're sure you're doing that, then this board can be the Flawless Technique board. But either way, you're sticking 1 point here. The reason you're doing that is because you want the bonuses on these boards and you don't want the bonus on the hemorrhage board. So even though you're trying to get to hemorrhage as quick as possible, you still don't want to add it earlier, because then you have to respec out of it and then add another board and then respec into it just to switch the order every time. That doesn't seem worth it to me. I would just spend the 6 points to get up into this next board, add the next board, and then not spec into it at all. Immediately go this direction, spend these 6 points to get to hemorrhage and get the hemorrhage node. Once you've done that, this says 80, level 80 Barbarian. You're lower, you're probably like 75 or whatever you are, 76, something like that, 77 maybe. Because you're going to have renown points to get there as well. Once you get there, you have 3 glyph slots because of your initial one. You have your board order set as far as it matters. You have the most bang for the buck node you can get for your damage on things that are going to live for more than 3 seconds, which is hemorrhage. And you can adjust within the glyph sections of each of these boards as you get glyphs and as they level up. And then your next points are probably spending the 3 points here to come down into the damage to elite section. So you're immediately getting a very, very good damage cluster here that you're also getting the bonus on first. So that would be the first. This is like a midway point on your board, and you're maximizing the value because these are the levels when you are pretty close anyway. These are the close to the levels when you're going to be doing the capstone dungeon to get into World Tier 4, I believe. So it's important to have not just some sort of maxed out, this is what my build will look like at a level 100 sort of build here. You should prioritize the things that are going to be beneficial to you right now. So this is what the transition point should look like. I do want to say something about I've seen some videos about rarities of glyphs and leveling up and whatnot. The threshold or the range on the rare glyphs is pretty substantial. It's only one less. It's only one less radius to start if the other website is correct. If it's not, if it's smaller, then so be it. Doesn't matter. At level 15, it maxes out. That's not so terrible. Something I think you should consider is that while you might not get the exact glyph you want early on, or you might get a fewer number of them, maybe you're missing one, these do switch out. You can stick something in there and make use of it while you wait to get the thing that you want, and it doesn't change your build dramatically. So you still, I think, should be working towards progressing towards your endgame Paragon state, and it should not be some sort of strange situation where you're radically changing what board you're on or what you're using and having like a whole bunch of inefficient points going to all sorts of places just because you think that somehow the glyphs are going to be a problem. Another thing to note is that leveling them up is a choice in terms of you pick which ones get leveled and don't. So it's kind of a finite resource. You run what, nightmare dungeons to level them up, right? And that finite resource is something you direct. So it's not like you're waiting until level 80, 90, whatever to get the glyph you have that you like to max out. You're maxing that out as soon as possible. That makes your early board choices, your early Paragon points, basically the ideal ones. So if you get the Revenge glyph, or if you get the Ire glyph, or if you're over here and you get Exploit, then your Paragon's situation is set. You are leveling that up as soon as possible. You're maxing that out as soon as possible. As soon as you get it and it's good, it's something that you want, you're sticking it in there and you're maxing out as soon as possible. So it's not like this situation that you don't have control over. It's not something where for some reason, you have a glyph that works in the last board and you have to max that out first and just not use it. That's not how this works. So you would just stick it in one of the other boards that could fit that attribute type, and you would just max it out there, or you would hopefully have one of the glyphs you want in your earlier boards, and you would just switch it out. So it's not so much of a situation where you have to have some radically different looking tree and path because glyphs are just unreasonably difficult. Alright, the next thing I want to talk about is something that I thought about for the last several days after I sort of realized I was stupid about the unconstrained key passive, which is permanent shouts. I think it's important to sort of go over, so that if you really think about it, that's a transition point in your character that radically changes the way you play, changes the skills you have, changes what's on your bar, changes everything about your character. Before that, shouts are good, but they're not great. I drop down to only having challenging shout for most of the game. Once I get to being able to have enough cooldown reduction to have permanent shout uptime, I immediately transition to permanent shouts and radically change my build. I think it totally changes the way you play your character because of what you have available all the time. You have a huge portion of damage reduction up all the time with challenging shout. You have extra damage and you have berserking on a pretty fairly regular basis with Warcry, and you have a great deal of Fury generation. You have the means to generate Fortify. You have run speed out of, what is it, Rallying Cry. And you're hitting these over and over and over again. So I think it's important to go over how you get to that transition, what you actually need to get there. So first, you are only getting cooldown reduction affixes on Amulet, Chest, and Helm. Your Amulet can have flat cooldown reduction, but also shout cooldown reduction. The Chest is just shout cooldown reduction, doesn't have the flat cooldown reduction. And the Helm just has the cooldown reduction. From the database website here, the effects are, or the values of the effects seem to be the same. So when you go to Amulet here, this is cooldown reduction, this is shout cooldown reduction, the numbers are the same. So it seems to be that the item power we saw in the beta went all the way up to the mid 300s. I'm assuming you're getting to this threshold of 460. You're getting over this threshold before you get to level 50, or pretty close. So you're probably looking at this threshold by the time you're getting to your World Tier 2 Capstone Dungeon. That would mean that your max value on your cooldown reduction is 7.5% on its like just flat roll. It would be 3.5. That's what these numbers mean. That's 3.5% and that's 7.5%. So, and that's the same for both of them. Let me get that other thing back up. So, you are probably not getting all the way to these values until you get past that. So you're, let's see, when do you get to item power 625 is the real question. So once you get over that, then you're looking at your final values. But I think it's interesting there's a few things of interest here. So your initial duration of your shouts is 6 seconds. You can increase them 24% on the tree with 3 points. That makes them 7.4 seconds. 7.44 to be exact. The CDR affixes, if you have, there's a little bit of a question about how these are calculated. So your initial cooldown is 25 seconds. If you have a 10% reduction, that's what this value is representing here. 25 times 0.9 times 0.9 0.9. So if you had three affixes on your gear of 10% reduction each, then that would result in a cooldown of 18.225 seconds. I don't think that they're going to be calculated that way, but they might be. So if you have shout duration reduction on your chest and your amulet, does it add them together and then do it separately, or add them together and then do it as a batch, like, which is what this? So if you had 10% shout cooldown reduction on your chest and your amulet, then the math could look like this: 25 seconds times 0.8 and then times 0.9, whatever 10% you had elsewhere. And that's obviously reducing it more. It doesn't really matter. It's not super substantial, super important. Something to note is that you don't need, there are 4 basically options. This is only 3 here. So this is 3 at 10%. If you have like 3 at like 8.5, you getting pretty close. If you have all 4, there are only 4 possible, because you can have 2 on the amulet, 1 on the chest, and 1 on the helm. If you have all 4, you maybe get to this early. So if you prioritize shout cooldown reduction and cooldown reduction on these 3 pieces of gear, then you get to this as quick as possible. Where that happens, I don't know. Maybe that's level 60, 75. Maybe that's level 50. I just don't know. It might be quick, it might be slow. Either way, it's going to radically change your character once you get there. Because once you get there, maxing out shouts and dropping the other stuff is going to be worthwhile. Something else that's important to note is that when you upgrade your gear, it also upgrades these values, obviously, but also it passes the tiers. So I have a... Okay, so this is just an example of within a tier. So 1.4 to 3, let me give credit here. So this guy, Rob2628 on Twitch, I watch his videos. I watched this whole thing, which is like 12 hours, which is kind of crazy. But he shows his gear at the end. I wish I'd done it to mine. I was not smart enough to do so. He shows the cooldown reduction on this, what is this? This helmet here. And he has upgraded it 3 times, and you can see how it is affecting his gear. He mouses over all of his gear in this video. So if you go to this video, you can look at the title here for Rob2628 on Twitch, and you go to, 12 hours and 28 minutes in, he will mouse over all his gear, and you can look at gear that's actually in the game. There's not a lot of information about this stuff online, not a lot of pictures out there right now, so this is a good resource if you're kind of wanted to, like for example, I wasn't sure if pole arms were considered slashing in the game, so I went here and I watched his video until he moused over a pole arm, and I saw that it said slashing. You can get benefits out of just seeing him mouse over his gear. He's also a very good player. He speedruns. His comments are very intelligent, so I recommend him highly if you want to. So, assuming you have enough CDR to reduce the cooldown of your shouts to 18 seconds or less, I think it's right around that threshold. I think you wouldn't have entirely permanent uptime with that, but we don't know how the math is going to look in this game. This number might be lower depending on how they calculate this. It might be that all of your cooldown reductions are added together, so this might be 25 times 0.7, not them done separately. If it is, you get more cooldown reduction if it's like that. Regardless, if you reach the threshold where this is like 18 seconds or less, then there's an aspect that goes on your ring, and if you're near 2 mobs when you shout, you get up to 5.4 seconds cooldown reduction for each of those mobs, 10.8 seconds. That drops this 18 seconds down to what? 7, can't do math right now. 7.2. If that's 7.2 is the cooldown on your shouts now all of a sudden you have perma uptime. So once you reach that threshold, you make the change. So you're basically looking for this. This aspect is important. It's called bold chieftains or something like that. So you're going to need that, but you're probably going to get that along the way. It's not going to be too impossible. If for some reason you don't, you're waiting for that. But otherwise, you're waiting for enough cooldown reduction on gear to make it so that when you mouse over your shout, the cooldown is somewhere below 18 seconds. Somewhere right around there. Something to point out, just in case you don't know, you probably do, that this is the aspect here. This is the bold chieftains, 2.7 to 5.4 seconds per nearby enemy. It shouldn't be too impossible to get 2 nearby enemies, so that's the threshold I'm sort of expecting to reach here. That's what the 18 seconds is about. And then that goes with this aspect of Echoing Fury. So this isn't from the codex. You can't just get this from the codex, and you wouldn't want it from the codex anyway. It wouldn't give you enough reduction to make it worthwhile. You need a high roll here. You need 5.2, 5.4, something. You need something good here, and you need to save that aspect. You need to save that aspect till pretty late in the game. Something that's interesting here is that this goes on rings, and your ring stats for the most part aren't going to be super crucial. So as long as you have a good roll here, you basically just wait till you get a ring that has the mods you want, and you stick it on, and you're good to go. And maybe you just don't upgrade your ring. What are you going to lose out on? A few percentages of resists and whatever. for the most part, that's fine. You want to store up these aspects. You want to save basically every bold chieftain's aspect you get, as long as it's somewhere close to 5 seconds or above. So be saving those along the way. This is the other part of the of that build here, which is going to make this crucial, which is aspect of Echoing Fury. You generate 2 to 4 seconds while your shout is active. It should stack for each shout, so this should be ×3. So if you get good rolls here, you're going to want it to be 4. So you can, this has a, if for some reason you're in a weird situation and this never drops, you can at least still get this from your codex. But generally speaking, you're going to want a good roll here. 3 or 4, probably 4. You only need one of them, which is nice. Again, it's on a ring, so the stats aren't super important. So get the ring set. I mean, there's crit on rings. What am I aiming for on rings? There's not much that's super important. There's nice stuff. You're going to probably want crit. So get something with some crit on it and drop this aspect on it and you're good to go. Something that's important to remember is that because you'll be running Rallying Cry, this is more. This is, I don't know how much more. I'm probably getting the Fortify enhancement on Rallying Cry instead of the one that gives more Fury. So this is whatever it is, 40-ish% resource generation. So let's say roughly half, because you're going to have plus skills stuff. So if this is 6 per, if your Fury generation per shout is actually 6, then it's 6, 12, it's 18 per shout. 18 Fury per second, on top of whatever Fury generating otherwise, tends to be, I would imagine, enough to not have to worry about Fury at all. You're probably swapping weapons at the point that's giving you Fury. You're still using your lunging strike, probably, that's giving you Fury. I'm probably going to be using the Death Blow add-on that instead of once you have perma shouts, you don't need the berserking here from Death Blow. You would transition up to this, which would give you more Fury every time you use Death Blow. That's 20. So your Fury generation becomes a non-issue. Your movement speed is increased, you have berserking all the time, and you have damage reduction. It's an extremely powerful combination, and it's probably what you should aim to acquiring as soon as possible and transition into it. Now we're going to get to a part of the video that's probably going to piss people off, and they're not going to agree. I'm going to go over my reasoning for why I think damage scaling is the way that it is, and talk about why that would maybe matter or doesn't matter at all. So I'm seeing a lot of videos and I just kind of disagree with them. They don't seem to make sense to me at all. I want to make my argument for why I think that's the case. And if you agree with me, great. If not, that's fine. My reasoning will hopefully inform you in some way. So my conception of weapon, of basically, they're calling them buckets. We love calling them buckets now. Of the buckets of different damage types is in this column here, which is, I think that generally speaking, you have your base weapon damage. It gets multiplied by almost all of the damage mods. So almost every mod, I think, goes in the same bucket. Basic, physical, dot, core, ultimate, whatever, slow to stun to healthy to injured, crowd controlled, close, bleeding, elites, wall healthy, wall berserking, and I think 2 vulnerable enemies still is also in this bucket. I think almost every mod you can get on a piece of gear goes in this bucket. I think almost nothing is multiplicative with these. I think they're all in the same bucket. Now that, I might be wrong, but I think they're all in the same bucket. And then I think after that you have multiplier effects, which are like the berserking damage bonus, the other key passive nodes are as well. So Unbridled Rage is a multiplier to core damage. Walking Arsenal is a multiplier as well. And then I think Walking Arsenal is additive with itself. Some people think it's multiplicative with itself. I think Berserk damage bonus is additive with itself. Other people think it's multiplicative with itself. In these cases, multiplicative is worse, additive is better. That maybe shouldn't matter to you. most of the aspects, a great deal of the aspects are multiplier effects. Uh, you can read them. Some of them are clearly multipliers, some not so much. Some actually are amount of damage of base damage. So I think that would skip the second bucket entirely and just give you damage based on your base damage. And that it says that specifically in the tooltip. It says percent of base damage. So those should be pretty clear. But I think those are multiplier effects. And then after that, the multiplier effects are crit, obviously, because your damage is then multiplied by some value when you crit and you do extra damage. Obviously, it shows up in a big number. There's also overpower. I didn't put it on this thing because it's annoying. Calculating the number with your health and then your fortify, it's just annoying. That's a multiplier as well, and crits can overpower, so that's a multiplier of this. But again, you only do it 3% of the time. I just don't care. It is a multiplier. I just don't care. I'm not putting it on this list. And then after that, the other section of multipliers, I think, is vulnerabilities. So vulnerable itself, the hemorrhage node, the revenge glyph has a thorns, which should be a multiplier. Anything that says makes a monster take more damage from you by a percentage should be a multiplier like vulnerable. And then I think that vulnerable damage and damage to vulnerable enemies, I don't think that actually scales vulnerable. If it does scale the damage bonus of vulnerable, then is it additive? Is it multiplicative? When you get, let's say, 20% vulnerable damage, is that giving you 2% more? Is that making vulnerable here? Well, I guess 20% would be 4. Is it making vulnerable 24%? Or is it making it 40? I just don't know. We don't know this. It could go either way. And that is pretty substantial. If it is actually directly affecting the multiplicative bonus you get from vulnerable, then it is significantly more valuable. I think, generally speaking, almost all of the damage mods you get are going to be in this first bucket here. I think it's that simple. I don't think there's like a 6, 7... I don't think there's a dozen buckets. So I'm going to give you my argument for why I think so. So the sheet I saw online, the person said that basic damage was separate from, like they said physical was up here in this one of these early buckets. Stun two like different types of enemies, two elites to bleeding to close, whatever was some bucket, and the wall was some bucket. Is a little convoluted, but I'm gonna just make this simple. Let's say I'm wrong, and that basic damage is multiplicative with all these other things that you're overwhelmingly getting on weapons, getting on your Paragon tree, whatever. I'm assuming that you're getting. Okay, so if you look at this is the math here. I'm assuming you're getting 400% of these damage mods, which is almost all the damage mods, and that is not a high number. That's kind of like a middle number. You're probably like level 60, 70, and you have more than this. Maybe even earlier. You might have this by level 50. And I'm kind of giving you meager options here, or meager bonuses here at the bottom too. So these are low damage numbers. I'm assuming you don't have great stacking, great synergy here. This is just a very low damage number sort of math thing I'm giving you here to give you an example. So this is assuming you have 0.2% bonus, a 20% bonus from some multiplier. So this is like you have hardly any aspects. Maybe you have berserking. Berserking would be more than this. I think this is 2. I think this is if you have 2. You have 2 of the bonuses from the Walking Arsenal passive. That's what this would be. Aspects are generally more than this, or close to this. So let's just assume you have 1 of those things. And this is if I'm assuming you're going to crit, whereas we're just going to throw these numbers together and make it easy. And I'm assuming the mob is vulnerable and nothing else. So like we're pretty meager sort of expectations here. If that's the case, then you do 100 damage base. I'm just using a round number. You have 400% damage in this bucket number 1, so that adds 400 damage. Together that's 500. 500, and you get 20 more percent from some multiplicative bonus here. That's giving you another 100. Those all totaled together add up to 600. 600, and half of that is 300. You're getting 300 more damage. And then this math is wrong. Alright, I corrected my math really quick. I saw my mistake. By the time you get here, you're doing 900 damage. 900 damage times 0.2 is 180. So all that together equals 1080. So 1080 damage. That's if my assumptions are correct about the buckets and whatnot here. If you go over here and you just separate basic damage, we're taking basic damage out of this bucket and we're keeping everything else the same. And we're doing that for a reason. We'll get to that later. 100 base, and we're removing 20% damage. So let's say you only had 20% basic damage here. We're removing 20% here. So we're making it 380 or times it by 3.8. Okay, so 100 base damage times 3.8 equals 380 damage. Then we're adding the basic in next. If you add the basic in next, the 20% we removed here, we're adding it here. That becomes 96. So instead of it adding 20 damage, it's adding 96. It's adding, so 76 more damage. That 76 more damage makes the multiplier effect from the 0.2, whatever you have here, from the maybe two weapon types of Walking Arsenal. Instead of extra 100, you're doing 115. The crit, as the math works out, instead of 300, you're doing 345. And that's just from each of these pieces. That's not them total together. And then the vulnerability here, instead of 180, you're doing 207. And when you total that out here at the bottom, that extra 76 here in this bucket makes this 1243. So instead of 1080, you're doing 1243. Now the plan's gone over. So that doesn't seem substantial, and it isn't meant to, because we're only talking about 20% damage to basic skills. 20% damage to basic skills is extremely minor. It's very easy to get. Is just almost nothing. Almost nothing increased your damage by what, like 10% or something? Something pretty substantial. 10-15% just by changing which bucket it's in. And you might say, yeah, that's just how it is. The damage is weird. It's like super powerful. I don't think that's right. I just don't think it works that way. And I think something to consider is that topaz gems, just the chipped ones, so we're talking about the ones we get at level 20 or whatever in beta, they're 12.5% for each one. And you can get 6 on a weapon as a warrior. That's 75%. If this 20% was 75%, it's significantly more. And then on top of that, a two-hand blunt that I had in beta with 239 item power, which is very low, had a top basic skill damage roll of 28%. So you're looking at very, very, very easily, we're talking about like a piece of blue gear and some gems getting over 100% of a mod here. And you're essentially saying that all the other stuff, to slowed, to healthy, to bleeding, to whatever, you're more than doubling those on basic skills just by adding a few gems. The basic skill mod roll on weapons is significantly higher than the other stuff, than to healthy, to slowed, to whatever. The basic skill mod roll is very high. And people say, yeah, but because the basic weapons just do less damage initially, and that's true, but this math doesn't work out very well very quickly. If you're making basic mod a multiplier with everything else, you're essentially making maybe even just spamming a basic skill a viable build because of how much basic skill damage you can get. I just don't think that makes sense. I don't think the math makes sense. I think if you plug a very reasonable number here, which would probably be something like 1.5, that's giving you what? 480 plus 240 is 720? 720 damage here? you're tripling your damage on basic skills because you've put a few gems in and you have like maybe 1 or 2 decent rolls on weapons. I just don't think that I don't think that makes sense. I think the conception you're seeing online of how damage buckets or what damage is in what bucket is just wrong. I think vulnerable is the same thing. You can get a great deal of vulnerable damage, and I don't think that it makes sense for it to be a multiplier. If it is, if it is here, it's definitely not additive. I'm very easily able to get like 60, 70, north of 100 damage to vulnerable enemies or vulnerable damage or whatever. Those are a little different, so there might be some nuances there about what the thresholds are, but you're able to get a very high value. The idea that you can just scale your vulnerable up to 50, 60, 70% of a multiplier of all of your other damage just doesn't make sense. I don't think that's the case. I think you should expect that all of your damage is going to be in this bucket here on terms of like your weapon affixes and your Paragon tree. And then this is generally effects like Berserk and the key passives and the aspects that you add on. Some of them fit in this section. And then there's crit. That's what makes crit so valuable, is if you can get good crit, that it being a multiplier of everything else makes it substantial damage. And that's also maybe why you don't see a great deal of crit damage in the Paragon boards. And then there's this. And this is just mobs taking more damage to you, basically. That's what this vulnerabilities bucket is. Now, some people separate out all of these effects. They're having vulnerable multiply hemorrhage, multiply the revenge glyph, and here too. I mean, you could pretend that Berserk is going to multiply into Unbridled Rage, into Walking Arsenal, into each of your aspects. You could do them all individually. You could make each of these damage types individual if you want and make bullshit math. But I think that's generally going to be bullshit math. I think you should assume the mods you can get very easily and stack very high are going to go in this bucket and all be added together, and thereby not be as multiplicative and as valuable as some of these videos are making them out to be. Okay, so generally speaking, this maybe doesn't matter to a degree, because as long as you aren't assuming something that is just flat out wrong, you're still getting. So you don't want to be choosing. You don't want to be choosing, let's say, vulnerable damage, even though let's say you can get 20% vulnerable damage, or you can get 50% damage to bleeding enemies. You don't want to be choosing the vulnerable damage, assuming that that's going to be a multiplier and therefore the math makes it work out. I don't think that's what you want to do. Maybe if on the 30th, when they drop more information, that's proven to be the case, they like actually have the damage numbers. I have not seen anything that makes me actually believe people yet. You want to be very skeptical of making a choice for a number that's much lower because someone said it's a multiplier, but you don't have actual evidence for it. And it's like fairly hard to test, so I'm not really entirely confident. Fortunately, I think for the most part, you aren't making these choices. The glyph that gives you vulnerable damage or damage to vulnerable targets is exploit. I'm taking it, and I still think it's part of this bucket. The numbers you're getting from it are similar to the numbers you're getting to other types of enemies like bleeding or whatever close. So I'm not actually making a choice assuming some of these values are much higher than they seem to be, and I don't think you should either. If for some reason I'm proved to be incorrect, which is certainly possible, we just don't know, we're guessing at this point, then you can make adjustments later on. But I think generally you should be skeptical of the damage bucket explanations you're seeing online. These are some tool tips from the game. Some are from the websites that show the skills or whatever, but generally speaking, so like this is from the game. If you see here, this is the basic. Oh, let me not do that. So this here is the basic skill damage from just a gem. This is a mod that was on a weapon that I found on that video that I showed you earlier. You see how it's giving 7 to 10% vulnerable damage? Well, that threshold is very similar to core. It's a little less, and I don't remember the item power of that item. It's a little less than damage to slowed or whatever. This is a two-hander. I think this is a one-hander. Basically, this value here, this vulnerable damage value here, in terms of the amount of the roll, the actual number, the 7 to 10 versus these others, is very similar. It's a very similar range. If it was a multiplier for some reason, I don't think that the number range would be similar. It should be much lower mathematically. It wouldn't make sense for one weapon you get a good roll on it, and that is like better than all of the other affixes on the weapon in terms of the amount of damage you get from them. That wouldn't make sense. And that would be for every build. I don't think that makes sense. There is something different here. So when it gives you critical strike damage on a weapon, that number is pretty substantial. I think something that's different there is you can make mobs vulnerable pretty easily and have them be vulnerable all the time. You really don't stack a great deal of crit in this game. You're probably topping out without the whirlwind aspect, which I think is kind of broken. You're topping out somewhere in the 30-ish percentage range. Assume even if you had max rolls and all this stuff, you're probably only looking at 35, whatever. There's some other things that give weird little bonuses to increase crit chance, like the wrath, not the wrath, the weapon swap mortal draw glyph. So there's some other things, but generally speaking, it's not like Path of Exile where you're getting to 50-60% crit and using a diamond flask. That I think they changed how that works, but it used to make it lucky, giving you an effective crit chance of like 75-80%. You're much lower in this game. You're probably below 40%. So that's a limiter on this value. That's why the value would be higher here, because it would assume you don't have that high of a crit chance, and you have to invest pretty heavily to change that dynamic, and that's why scaling crit works, but it also takes a lot of work and it requires a great deal of gear. You can ignore all the other stuff on the screen. I was going to talk about it, but I'm not going to anymore. These are just the 4 key passives. This is Berserking, and this is the Exploit Cliff. I think I've made my case. If I turn out to be wrong, that's fine. I would love to know one way or the other. I don't care about being wrong. I would like to know how to scale my damage effectively. I just don't believe the people who are making guesses right now. And I don't think you should either. That's it. That's the end of that's the end of the video. That's pretty much what I've learned and changed over the last week. I wasn't going to be playing early access, but I am now because I want to do the first 1,000 to 100 on hardcore. So we'll see how that goes. That should be fun. I hate paying extra money to start early. I think that's a lame dynamic, and I wouldn't have started early otherwise, but you know, whatever. It should be fun. The $20 is worth the fun of the race. I don't really care about the statue, but it'd be cool to be in the top 1,000. So I'll see you in the game. If you have any questions, go ahead and post a comment. I hope this helped you. I know that I'm not a content creator. I'm not actually trying to be a content creator. I'm just sharing information. I've seen a lot of people, there's a lot of streamers and stuff putting out a bunch of information. I think that they aren't as focused on one class, on one type of the game, and so they're sort of missing things. They're entertainers. I'm not really interested in that. I'm just trying to share my information. If you find this helpful, great. And I appreciate the comments. All right. Bye-bye.